Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about life, death, and what lies beyond. An innocent child without any influence dies for 11 minutes and returns with a message that seems to have come directly from the heavens. Why her? What exactly did she see? And most importantly, why is this message so urgent for our times? Stay until the end, because this revelation could change your way of seeing the spiritual world forever. His name is Albert Dawson, just 6 years old, and it all started on an ordinary afternoon in Asheville, a quiet town in the mountains of North Carolina, where people still keep their faith on the front door and the framed verses on the wall. It was just any other Saturday, one of those days where life seems to take its course without rushing. The mother was in the kitchen, the father was in the yard, and Albert, well, he was running, laughing, making up games with the dog as he always did. Nothing that day indicated that anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. The sky was clear, the air was light. It was one of those simple but peaceful moments, the kind of moment that we only realize is precious after it passes. But in a matter of seconds, everything changed. Albert fell, just like that. No warning, no sound of pain. Her small body simply collapsed onto the lawn. The mother ran to him, still believing it was a joke. But it only took one look to realize that he wasn't moving, he wasn't breathing. The eyes were open, but there was something missing there, as if the soul had left the body. The scream she let out at that moment was trapped in the walls of that house. His father tried to revive him. The ambulance was called. The minutes dragged on. When the rescuers arrived, they were quick, firm, but the expression on their faces said it all. It was serious, very serious. On the way to the hospital, the silence inside the ambulance was only broken by the orders of the paramedics. Cardiac massage, medications, shock. With each failed attempt, despair increased. Time passed relentlessly, and for our minutes, the devices said the same thing. No sign of life. But against all expectations, the impossible happened. The heart monitor beeped, one beat, then another. Albert's heart started beating again. The eyes opened. The lungs expanded. The doctors looked at each other in disbelief. Science couldn't explain it, but the mother fell to her knees, and the only thing she said was, "Thank you, Lord." From then on, everything became quieter, slower. Albert was taken to the ICU, monitored, surrounded by care. Doctors expected confusion, forgetfulness, slow reactions. But as the hours passed, it became clear that he wasn't just fine. It was different. It wasn't the same boy. It was as if he had come back quieter on the outside and fuller on the inside. The look was no longer that of a child. It was from whoever saw it, but no one knew what. And he, for a while, didn't seem to want to talk about it either. His mother watched him carefully. I expected questions, some kind of reaction, but Albert remained silent, like someone carrying something too heavy to put into words. Sometimes he looked at the ceiling as if he heard voices that no one else heard. In others, he would hold his mother's hand in silence for long minutes. She said that in those moments, she felt a strange peace, and at the same time, an inexplicable anguish. That first night in the hospital, something curious happened. Albert asked for a Bible. Nobody understood. He barely knew how to read properly, but he wanted to hold the book. He held it on his lap, in silence, running his hands over the open pages. Didn't read. It just played, as if it reconnected him with something he couldn't name. In the days that came, the doctors were surprised. No sequelae, no mental confusion. On the contrary, Albert demonstrated clarity, calm, and unusual maturity. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was as if every word was measured, as if he knew that saying too much could be dangerous, or perhaps not understood. Once the nurse entered the room and found Albert sitting with his eyes closed. She thought he was asleep, but he said in a low voice, "I'm here, but there's a part of me that's still somewhere else." The sentence made her stop. She didn't know what to answer. She just stood there, still, with her heart racing, trying to understand what that boy wanted to say. And as strange as it seemed, she felt like it made sense. Little by little, Albert began to express small fragments. Not complete stories, just loose sentences, thoughts that escaped, as if they came from far away. The world has moved away. Many people pray but don't listen. Children still remember what adults forget, and these phrases began to circulate among nurses, visitors, pastors. People started visiting Albert, Some said it was to bring comfort, but they left comforted. Others wanted to understand and left with more questions than answers. The city became restless. The story spread from mouth to mouth, and no one knew exactly what had happened in that 11-minute interval. But everyone knew something was different. Albert didn't talk about what he saw, it didn't detail, it didn't count. At least, not yet. What he experienced in that silence between life and death remained within him, guarded as something sacred. He just carried that in his eyes, in the way he looked at the sky, in the pauses between one breath and another, as if he was waiting for the right moment, or the right words. And since you've come this far, it's because something inside you is feeling it too. When stories like this move us, it's not just emotion, it's a sign. So like this video now, and subscribe to the channel. There's something bigger going on, and you might be right where you need to be to hear what comes next. The following days in the hospital were marked by a different silence. It was not the common silence of a clinical room, but something denser, almost sacred. Albert's words came in whispers, spaced out, as if they were being snatched from a distant place where time and human understanding work differently. He spoke little, but when he did, the gazes around him stopped. Nurses, doctors, even visitors to other patients. Everyone felt something that no one could explain precisely. It was as if, in every sentence Albert said, there was a part of something bigger, something that was yet to come, but that he carried in his chest. The morning he finally decided to tell what he experienced during the 11 minutes in which his body was lifeless, everything around him seemed calmer. The sun came through the cracks in the window, drawing golden lines across the room. He called his mother with a simple, "Mommy, can I tell you something?" and waited for her to sit down next to the bed. Her eyes were already teary even before the first word. Albert looked ahead, fixed on a spot that wasn't there. Then in a calm voice he began, "When everything went dark, I didn't feel scared." He said that the moment he fell into the backyard, he felt like he was being pulled out of himself. Not with violence, not with pain. On the contrary, it was as if he was leaving his body in the same way that we take off tight clothes after a tiring day. He felt lightness, a lightness he had never experienced before, and in the blink of an eye, I was no longer where I used to be. He described the environment as a kind of endless space, a place that had no ceiling or floor, but at the same time was full of presence. He said it wasn't dark, but it wasn't light in the sense we know it either. It was like being inside a light, but a light that had weight, texture, sensation, a light that touched the skin and the heart at the same time. I didn't see with my eyes. It was as if I saw with my whole body, he explained. At one point he felt like he was floating, not like free flight, but like being gently guided, as if something or someone was leading that journey, and even without seeing any face or defined shape, he felt completely protected. He said there was an indescribable peace, something impossible to compare with any sensation here on earth. A calm that made all fear, all doubt, all pain disappear. He didn't mention names, nor did he say what exactly was there. He just used simple words to describe something that clearly exceeded his childhood vocabulary. It was beautiful, but it wasn't an ornamental beauty. It was a beauty that made my heart beat faster, and everything there felt right. In that place, he said, he began to feel other presences. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they were there. Beings that communicated not with words, but with thoughts. It was as if each of them sent a feeling straight to his heart. Love, welcome, security. And even without exchanging a single sentence, Albert understood that those beings were there for him. They knew who he was. They knew his name, his story, his fears. And yet, they loved him without measure. Albert took a long pause before continuing. His mother just held his hand without saying anything, with her eyes fixed on him, as if she didn't want to miss a second of that moment. Then he said something that made the room seem to freeze in time. He said that in the midst of this light he began to remember things, but that he didn't live here. He missed something he couldn't explain. He said his heart was beating for something that seemed to be from before, from long ago, and it made him cry, not with sadness, but with a kind of emotion he himself couldn't understand. It was like I had come home, even though I had never been there before. As he described this feeling, his voice became quieter, almost like a whisper. He said he started to hear something, not an ordinary sound, but a kind of melody, a music that didn't come from instruments, but from within the things themselves, as if the entire environment sang, the colors, the lights, the thoughts themselves, and this melody completely enveloped him. It was as if each note touched a part of the soul. I felt like no one was alone. He said that, at a certain point, the sensation of movement stopped, and he stood there, just watching, feeling. Everything seemed perfect, but even in that place where there was no time as we know it, there was a moment when something changed. He said he felt a different presence, non-threatening, but firm, intense, as if someone very important had just arrived. When his mother asked who he was, he just looked into her eyes and said, "I knew he knew me, and I knew I was little, but he loved me anyway." The words were spoken with reverence. There was no explanation beyond that, just a respectful silence, as if that moment couldn't, and perhaps shouldn't, be described in detail. The father, who until then had only been listening from afar, entered the room at that moment. He sat in silence next to his son, and for the first time in a long time he didn't try to understand rationally, just listened. And when he heard it, he began to cry. Albert said that this presence did not speak with its mouth, but he heard something inside it. Something as clear as any human voice, and it was a message. He did not repeat the content of the message, not at that moment. He just said it was something that made his heart race, that made him want to go back, not for him, but for others. I didn't want to leave there, but I understood that it wasn't time yet. When he finished counting, he just remained silent, and the mother, with a trembling voice, asked, "Son, how did you feel when you came back?" Albert smiled, weak but true. And he said, "I felt like I brought something with me, but I'm still figuring out what it is." These words echoed in the parents' minds for the next few days. They didn't know what to do with it all, how to count, how to explain, who would believe, but inside their hearts something had already changed. The simple fact that Albert was there, alive, and talking like that, was enough. After that first report, Albert's parents began to observe him even more closely. Every word, every gesture, every silence seemed to carry a different weight. He didn't tell everything at once. It was as if parts of what he experienced came to light little by little as he felt ready to share, or perhaps as the people around him were ready to listen. In the room, which previously seemed like just another hospital unit, the atmosphere was now different. Doctors and nurses entered in silence. Some left notes with Bible verses on the table next to the bed. Others just stopped by to see him discreetly. No one said it in full words, but everyone knew. There was something about that boy that transcended the ordinary. It was more than a medical miracle. It was a calling, a sign, a bridge between two worlds. On a colder afternoon, with the sky overcast and the sound of soft rain tapping against the window, Albert called his father. He asked to talk alone. The father, even though he was restless inside, remained calm. He sat next to the bed, held his son's hand and waited in silence. It was then that Albert looked deep into his eyes and said, "Dad, I remember something I saw, and I don't know if I should tell you everything, but it's important." There was a delicate tension in the voice, as if he was searching for the right words for something that simply doesn't fit into human language. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and began to speak. He said that at a certain point in the experience, while floating in that light-filled space where time and place seemed to not exist, a subtle change happened. The surrounding light began to transform. It wasn't dark, but dense, and along with this density, a different feeling took over the environment. It wasn't fear, but there was seriousness, urgency. It felt like the place wanted to show me something I needed to see, he explained, and that's when he started having visions. Not like dreams or memories. He himself said that they were not images that came from the mind, but that they came from outside, as if they were placed directly into his consciousness. He said he couldn't close his eyes to stop seeing. Everything was there, in front of him, like a movie that needed to be watched. And he watched. What Albert described next was said carefully, with long pauses between one sentence and the next. It was as if each image still lived inside him, alive, latent, marking his soul with intensity. He spoke quietly, sometimes with lost eyes, as if reliving every second. He said he saw a big city. I didn't know which one it was. I didn't recognize the place, but I felt it was important. Everything there was in motion. People walking hurriedly, horns blaring, artificial lights. But there was something strange, a tension in the air, a silence hidden behind the noise. And then, like a breath, everything changed. The city began to grow dark, as if a shadow had fallen over it. It was no ordinary night. It was a thick, almost palpable darkness. People looked up, scared. There was running, shouting. Some knelt in the middle of the street. Others ran aimlessly. The chaos seemed to grow like a wave, and then silence. Albert couldn't exactly describe what happened next, but he said he felt a presence that was not the same as the one he felt in the place of light. This presence was firm, intense, and brought with it a feeling of alertness. He used a word that scared his father: notice. He said that in that vision, everything that was hidden began to be exposed. Unspoken words, hidden actions, disguised intentions, as if every heart was revealed. He said, "I saw things as they are, not as people show." And then he looked at his father and said, there was something really big about to happen, and almost no one was paying attention. These phrases were enough to silence any questions. The father just got up, walked to the window and stood there, watching the rain run down the glass without saying anything. Inside him, everything was in motion, and no matter how much I tried to find a logical explanation, I already knew there wasn't one. Albert did not speak dramatically. There was no exaggerated emotion. He just reported, with a kind of tranquility that for those listening was even more impactful. It was as if everything had been planted inside him for a purpose, and now, little by little, it was sprouting. The next day, it was the mother's turn to listen to another part. This time he talked about something he saw involving people, crowds, but not in the numerical sense. It was as if each individual was shown to him in detail. He said he saw faces, lost looks, people sitting on the edge of sidewalks with empty faces. Many had their eyes fixed on something, but that something wasn't there. It was as if everyone was being distracted by something invisible, while something very important was happening on the other side. His mother asked him what he felt when he saw that, and he just replied, sadness. It was like no one listened anymore, no one stopped, no one remembered. That phrase was spinning around in her mind for days. No one remembered. What? From who? Why? But Albert said no more. He just left these sentences loose, like clues to something much bigger, which still couldn't, or shouldn't, be said completely. He also started behaving differently, more collected, more observant. Sometimes he cried alone in silence, but when someone asked, he just said, "It's because there are still a lot of people who don't know." At these times, his mother could only hug him. The heart was tightening. The desire to protect him grew. But she understood that this was not something that could be protected with human arms. It was something spiritual, something you don't catch, don't measure, don't explain. You just feel it. And that's what I want to ask you now. Have you ever felt like something was about to be revealed? Have you ever had the feeling that the spiritual world was trying to warn you, but you couldn't understand exactly what? Have you ever experienced something that you couldn't explain but felt like it was God trying to show you something? He comments, I felt that God wanted to show me something. Your experience can awaken whoever is reading. Nothing gets here by chance. And what Albert began to reveal could no longer be ignored. That night was long for everyone. The hospital, even with its artificial lights and precise routine, seemed to have stopped in time. Nurses passed more slowly through the corridors. Some doctors walked without talking to each other, absorbed in thought. It was not common to witness a case like Albert's. It was unusual to hear from a child of just 7 years old a story so full of meaning, spirituality and symbols that many adults would spend their entire lives without even touching. The mother remained at the bedside, almost without blinking. The red eyes were not just from tiredness but from something deeper. She didn't know if she was crying out of gratitude, fear, emotion, or pure helplessness. Everything his son said seemed to come from a sacred, untouchable place. And the more he talked, the more she felt that the child she knew was still there, but now carrying wisdom that no one had taught her. The father, on the other hand, was more restrained. He walked from side to side, stopped at the window, looked at the sky, then sat down, got up again. His silence spoke loudly. He was trying to understand, trying to find a logical, rational, concrete explanation. But as much as I wanted to, there was something there that completely escaped any human understanding. A divine mystery that did not bend to adult logic, something that could only be felt and accepted. The doctors, despite their professional posture, were also visibly touched. One of the hospital's most experienced cardiologists, Dr. Nolan, confessed in a low voice during a shift change, This isn't just medicine. This boy saw something, and no one can say otherwise." Another point that began to bother the health professionals themselves was the precision with which Albert described what had happened during the 11 minutes in which his body was without vital signs. He said, for example, that he heard a nurse's voice saying, "We're not going to give up, he's just a child." This phrase, said in despair in the resuscitation room, had never been repeated outside. Not even the parents knew, but Albert repeated it exactly. Later, he also spoke of the sound of the pressure device falling to the floor and the unsuccessful attempt to adjust one of the machine's cables. He even said he saw the youngest doctor on duty shaking his hand when he tried to administer the adrenaline injection. Nobody had mentioned that. But when the medical team was questioned, they all confirmed that the details were correct. This information left professionals in a state of silent shock. None of them dared to contradict. None tried to rationalize, on the contrary. One of the residents even commented to another, in the dim light of the restroom, "If this isn't proof that there is something after death, then I don't know what is." The repercussion among hospital employees began to grow. Gradually, some began to enter Albert's room not just to check vital signs or change medications, but to listen, simply listen. And they often left there with teary eyes. He didn't make speeches. He didn't consider himself special, but his presence was different. His speech carried truth, a truth that did not need to be explained. It could only be felt. The news spread quickly among the employees, and before long, people from other floors were asking to meet him. A nurse in the oncology ward began leaving handwritten notes on the bedside table. Phrases like, "God still speaks," or "There is purpose in what you saw, little one," began to appear at the bedside. And the parents went through a silent transformation. The mother, who previously prayed only in times of difficulty, now knelt every day before breakfast. He didn't ask for any more answers. He just said, "Lord, thank you for allowing me to see what I still don't understand." The father, although more reserved, could not resist what was happening. One morning, while he thought his son was sleeping, he was taken by surprise by Albert's voice saying, "Daddy, God still loves you, even when you think you don't deserve it." He didn't respond. He just sat down in the next armchair, held his face in his hands and cried. It wasn't an explosive cry, it was a long, deep, restrained cry, as if old regrets were finally being dissolved within him. As if all the unasked questions, all the unsaid prayers, all the silences had at that moment found an echo in a simple sentence coming from his son's mouth. And the more time passed, the clearer the feeling became that what Albert experienced was not just for him. It was for everyone around him, as if he had become a mirror for anyone who wanted to see deeper, for anyone who had the courage to admit that there is more between heaven and earth than meets the eye. The pastor of the local church went to the hospital. He arrived with the Bible in his hands, but left without opening it. He said it wasn't necessary. "The word is already being said," he stated, his eyes filling with tears. He also said that, in his entire life of faith, he had never felt the presence of God so palpably as in that room. It was as if the environment itself was permeated with something eternal. And the most impressive thing was that Albert didn't try to convince anyone. He didn't preach, he didn't attract attention. It just existed. And by existing, it touched lives. People who didn't talk to each other started talking to each other again. Parents who lived in conflict with their children began to get closer. Nurses began to pray before their shift. A doctor who called himself an atheist began to read the Psalms in secret. All because of the reaction of a boy who, when he came back from the brink of death, brought with him something invisible, but absolutely real. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about all of this is that Albert, even though he was so small, seemed to understand the impact of what was happening. But he never boasted. He never sought attention. Sometimes I would look out the window and say, "There are still a lot of people who don't know what's coming." And then he returned to his silence. And in the next few minutes, and something happens that shakes everything around. Time passed, but nothing was the same again. There was something different about Albert, not just in the way he spoke or behaved, but in his presence. It was as if he carried a silence that spoke louder than any speech, a silence full of meaning, a silence that seemed to speak directly to the invisible, with the eternal. In the days following his recovery, the Dawson household became quieter. Not out of sadness, but out of respect. It was as if everyone who entered there felt that that home now housed something sacred, an atmosphere that demanded listening, reverence, contemplation. Albert's room, once decorated with colorful toys and drawings, now looked like a prayer space. Not because someone intentionally transformed him, but because he became that way. Naturally. Albert slept little. He said the dreams were too intense. I woke up in the middle of the night with my eyes full of water and stared at the ceiling in silence. When asked, he responded with simple sentences, but they carried a weight that only those who have felt the presence of God can understand. "Mommy, they're not ready yet. There are people who think it's just a story, but it's not. I feel like there's still a lot to say, but the time isn't there." These words left the parents silent. There was nothing to answer. The father started to leave early to walk alone through the forest near the house. He carried a Bible in his pocket. Sometimes I read, sometimes I just walked. The mother, in turn, changed the music in the house. The devices that previously played cartoons and children's songs now reproduced old hymns, soft melodies, and praises of delivery. She said she could no longer hear anything else. It was as if the ordinary sound of the world had lost its meaning. Albert also started to move away from some things. I couldn't watch cartoons anymore, don't laugh at the same jokes. I wasn't interested in the same toys. It was as if childhood had been cut short, not by trauma, but by revelation. He hadn't lost his shine. It was just lit by another source now, a source that did not come from the screen, but from the soul. One afternoon, his mother found him in the backyard, kneeling. I was praying, eyes closed, hands clasped, face serene. She approached silently, not wanting to interrupt. When he finished, he turned around and said calmly, "I'm not praying for myself, Mom. I'm praying for those who will still hear." That phrase kept bouncing around inside her for days. What do you mean they'll still hear? Listen to what? When? Why? But, as usual, Albert didn't explain too much. He just left clues, words scattered like seeds in fertile ground. And each of his phrases seemed to sprout within whoever listened, generating different fruits in each heart. Grandparents came to visit. They couldn't hold back their tears when they saw him so serene. They expected to find a shaken, fragile boy, but they saw someone at peace, a look that didn't match his age but that conveyed a certainty that only the wise carry. The grandmother, upon leaving the room, held her son's hand, Albert's father, and said with teary eyes, "This boy saw something. He has God in his eyes." And really, even the neighbors noticed. Some came to bring food, others just to offer help. But almost everyone, upon entering the house, changed their behavior. They lowered their voices and walked slowly. Some cried without knowing why. A woman from the next street, who hadn't set foot in a church for years, asked to talk to Albert. They sat on the porch for a few minutes. She left there just saying, "I don't know what happened, but I felt peace." And the most shocking thing was that Albert didn't talk much. He didn't preach, he didn't tell everything he saw, but there was a different frequency in him, as if you were in tune with another dimension, as if he heard things that no one else heard, as if seeing beyond the veil. At night he continued to have dreams, dreams that made him wake up wide-eyed. Sometimes I drew what I saw, intertwined circles, open doors, figures surrounded by light. Other nights I just wrote loose words on pieces of paper, words like time, prepare, to hear, to wake up, and to go back. One of those nights, when he woke up crying, he hugged his mother and said softly, "There's still time, but it has to be now." She didn't ask why. He just held his face and prayed in silence, not for answers, but for understanding. She knew deep down that faith is not about understanding everything. It's about trusting the invisible. And at that moment, the only thing she could do was trust. The father, increasingly touched, began to participate in church activities. At a prayer meeting, he asked to speak. He told what was happening to his son. He didn't go into detail, but he was honest in saying that his worldview had changed, that God had knocked on his door in the most unlikely way, through his son. And now, all he wanted was to be aware so he would never again ignore what previously went unnoticed. Albert, for his part, was not an attention seeker. I didn't want applause, just followed, calmly, with a serenity that didn't match his 7 years, but that seemed to be born from a much deeper place. When asked how he felt, he just said, "I feel like I have to stay tuned, that there's more coming, and that I need to be ready." These words echoed in the hearts of those who heard them. And the truth is that no one could continue life as before. There was a new rhythm, a new look, a new urgency, as if something had been activated within each one. After everything you have heard so far, perhaps you are feeling a silence within you, a different silence. Not that empty silence which is scary, but a silence that makes you think, a silence that asks quietly, deep in the soul, "What about me? Am I hearing what I need to hear?" This kind of silence is the same as it was in the Dawson house, the same one that settled in Albert's room after he returned from that supernatural experience that changed everything. When something spiritual touches a person's life in such a profound way, as it happened to Albert, there is no way to escape unscathed. There is no way to look at the world in the same way. And perhaps without realizing it, you are also starting to see differently, starting to remember something he already knew, but that the rush of life erased. Starting to feel like there's more going on than meets the eye, that there is an invisible call echoing, not just for the chosen, not just for those who have been praying for years, but for everyone, including you. We live in a noisy world where everything distracts us. News, social networks, responsibilities rush, and in this chaos, what is spiritual is being stifled, silenced, ignored. But when stories like this reach us, it's as if a window opens in the middle of everything, a gap between heaven and earth. And for a brief moment we can feel that God still speaks, that He still uses people, that He still chooses the little ones to say big things, that He still reveals the invisible to those who have attentive ears. And it is at this point that the question becomes inevitable. Are you prepared for what comes next? Really prepared? Not just with ready answers, but with an available heart. Have you been stopping to listen to the signs? Have you noticed God's discreet messages in your daily life? Or have you been living automatically, leaving the spiritual for later, as if later was guaranteed? I know it's not always easy to stop and reflect on life, on death, on the purpose of being here. These are subjects that we often avoid, out of fear, out of pain, out of lack of answers. But what if that's exactly what you need right now? What if this story came to you not by chance, but as a sign, a reminder that there is something more, a touch from God to wake you up? Albert did not come away from his experience with promises of success, riches, or easy answers. He came back different. And even at such a young age, he began to live with his eyes more open than many adults who knew the Bible from cover to cover. This teaches us something profound. It's not about age, nor about knowing everything. It's about spiritual sensitivity. It's about being awake. And if God is allowing stories like this to reach so many people, it's because there is still time. There is still a space for mercy. There's still a chance to hear it, to start over, to reconcile. The afterlife exists, but preparation for it begins now, in yours today, in what you decide to listen to, what you choose to live in. Maybe you felt something different while listening to this story. A shiver, a lump in the throat, a memory that came back, a longing for what you can't even explain. This is no coincidence, it's spiritual, and the spiritual world moves with small signs, little beats in the heart, words that come as whispers and stir inside. So before moving on, I want to invite you to do something simple but powerful. Close your eyes for a few seconds and ask a question. Lord, what do you want to show me with this story? And listen, in truth, because He speaks. And sometimes it speaks like this, through a child, through a video, through silence. And I also want to invite you to write here in the comments. It doesn't have to be a long testimony. It could just be a sentence, a word, a sensation. But write. Because when you share what you felt, you activate something in whoever reads it. You become part of the message. And sometimes what comes out of your heart can be exactly what someone needed to not give up on faith. There are things that reason cannot explain, but the soul recognizes immediately. When a child speaks with the voice from heaven, it's not just a coincidence, it's a calling. Whoever feels it knows. Whoever listens understands, and whoever believes responds. Write in the comments, I believe that God speaks through children, because your every word is part of something bigger, something that goes beyond logic and reaches hearts. Some goosebumps are not just from the body, they are responses from the soul. When something touches you in a way that you can't explain, it could be more than just emotion. It could be God calling you back. And when He speaks, we recognize it. Sign up now, because on this channel, Each story is more than a report. It's a reminder of what really matters, a journey back to what is eternal. When a story touches you so deeply that it seems like it was written for you, that's not chance. It's purpose. Leave your like now. This simple gesture can take this message to those who need to hear it most, at the right time. Something is yet to come, and it might be exactly what your soul needs to hear. Now click on the video that is appearing on the screen. There is something there that is not by chance. It could be the way God chose to speak to you today,